They worshipped my perfect brother until he ruined everything. Now they expect me to fix his mess, but I'm done being their backup plan. Growing up, it was clear to everyone who the favorite was. My older brother, Jake, was the perfect son in my parents' eyes. He was the quarterback in high school, graduated at the top of his class, and got into an Ivy League college. My parents, Ellen and George, were practically obsessed with him. They lived for his football games, plastered the walls with his awards, and brought him up in every conversation like he was the second coming of Christ. And me? I was Eric, the quiet one, the artsy one, the kid who preferred books and sketchpads to sports and parties. I wasn't a troublemaker, but I wasn't extraordinary, and in my family, good wasn't good enough. If Jake got an A, it was celebrated with a dinner out. If I got an A, it was, well, that's what you're supposed to do. I didn't hate Jake, but I resented the way my parents put him on a pedestal. He wasn't mean or anything, if anything, he was oblivious to the favoritism. He'd ruffle my hair and say, "You'll find your thing, buddy," like he was doing me a favor by acknowledging me. It wasn't his fault, but it didn't make it any easier living in his shadow. I tried to find ways to stand out, to make my parents proud in my own right. I got into art school on a scholarship, started working as a graphic designer, and built a steady, independent life. But no matter what I achieved, it was never enough. My dad would say, "Good for you, but Jake's managing a whole team at his firm now," or, "Jake's thinking about buying a second house, how great is that?" That dynamic defined our family for years. Jake was the golden child, and I was, the other one. Until everything fell apart. It all started with a phone call from my mom late one night. Her voice was shaking, and she was speaking so fast that it took me a moment to piece together what she was saying. Jake had been arrested. At first, I couldn't believe it. Jake, the family's shining star, in trouble with the law. But as she filled in the details, it became clear how serious things were. Jake's firm had discovered he'd been embezzling money for years, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Someone tipped off the authorities, and now he was facing fraud and theft charges. I sat there in shock as she cried on the other end of the line. This was Jake we were talking about, the golden child who could do no wrong. The guy who was always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. How had this happened? My mom kept saying things like, "This can't be true," and "Jake's not that kind of person." But the facts were undeniable. His accounts didn't add up, and the firm had concrete evidence against him. She begged me to come over the next day, saying the family needed to stick together during this horrible misunderstanding. When I hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about how their perfect image of Jake had come crashing down. For years, he'd been their pride and joy, the one they could always count on to make them look good. Now, he was the source of their shame. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me was angry that they'd ignored my accomplishments for years while propping Jake up, only for him to betray their trust. But another part of me felt guilty for even thinking that. This wasn't about me, right? It was about Jake and the mess he'd created. Little did I know, that mess was about to become my problem too. The next day, I went to my parents' house, unsure of what to expect. When I walked in, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My mom looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes puffy from crying. My dad was pacing the living room, muttering about lawyers and reputations. Jake was there too, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. For a moment, I barely recognized him. He looked smaller, like the weight of everything had crushed the confidence that used to radiate from him. My dad started talking as soon as I sat down, filling me in on the situation. Jake's firm had frozen his assets, and the case was moving quickly. They were scrambling to find a good lawyer, but the fees were astronomical. My mom chimed in, saying how the family's savings were already stretched thin. Then they looked at me. "Eric," my dad said, "we need your help. Jake's in a tough spot, and we can't do this alone." It took me a second to realize what he meant. They were asking me for money, to help cover Jake's legal fees, pay off debts, and, as my mom put it, keep the family afloat. I was stunned. For years, they'd brushed aside my achievements and treated me like an afterthought, and now they were asking me to fix the mess their golden child had made? When I didn't respond right away, my mom jumped in, saying how Jake was still my brother, how he'd made a mistake but deserved a second chance. She begged me to think about how much this was affecting the family, how they'd always taught us to stick together no matter what. I wanted to say no. Every fiber of my being was screaming to walk away. But the guilt was overwhelming. They weren't just asking me for help, they were framing it as my duty, as if I owed it to them and to Jake. I told them I needed time to think about it. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't going to end well. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and endless family meetings. My parents were in full crisis mode, scrambling to salvage Jake's life and their image along with it. Every time we talked, the pressure on me grew stronger. "Eric, we're all pitching in," my mom would say, though "all" seemed to mostly mean me. My dad was constantly reminding me how much Jake had done for the family, how much potential he still had, and how this was just a temporary setback. The guilt trips were relentless. "He's your brother," my mom said during one particularly heated conversation. "You wouldn't be where you are today without this family, and now it's your turn to step up." It wasn't just money they wanted, either. They expected me to show up to meetings with lawyers, help Jake sort through his finances, and even vouch for his character if the case went to court. The implication was clear: I was the stable one, the dependable one, and it was my job to keep everything from falling apart. Jake didn't ask directly, but his silence spoke volumes. Every time I saw him, he looked like a shadow of the brother I used to know. He'd mutter apologies, talk about how he didn't mean for things to get this bad, and then go quiet when the conversation turned to how to fix it. It was like he expected someone else to clean up the mess for him, and my parents were more than happy to volunteer me for the job. I tried to push back, to set boundaries. I told them I couldn't afford to drain my savings or take on the emotional weight of fixing Jake's life. But every time I said no, they acted like I was betraying the family. "You've always been so independent," my dad said one night, his voice full of disappointment. "We thought you'd want to help." It felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. They didn't want me to just help, they wanted me to sacrifice my own stability to bail out Jake. And the more I resisted, the more they tried to guilt me into falling in line. I started to wonder if this was the role I'd been cast in all along, the reliable one, the backup plan. And now that Jake, their golden child, had fallen, they expected me to step into the spotlight and save the day. But I wasn't sure I wanted the role they were so desperate to give me. The breaking point came during yet another family meeting at my parents' house. My dad had invited Jake's lawyer to discuss the case, and the room was packed with tension. Jake sat quietly in the corner, while my mom nervously sipped her tea. The lawyer laid everything out: the charges, the potential prison time, and what it would take to mount a proper defense. The cost was staggering, way beyond what my parents could afford, even if they drained every penny of their savings. That's when my dad turned to me. "Eric, we need you to step up," he said. "This is your brother's future on the line. You're doing well for yourself, and we know you can help." I stared at him, stunned by how casually he said it, as if it was a given that I'd take on this burden. "I've already told you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't do this. I've worked hard to build my life, and I'm not putting it at risk to fix something Jake did." The room went silent. My dad's face hardened, and my mom looked like I'd just slapped her. "How can you say that?" my mom said, her voice trembling. "He's your brother. He made a mistake, but he needs us now more than ever." "I'm not the one who did this," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "Jake is the one who stole from his company. Jake is the one who broke the law. And yet, somehow, I'm the one who's supposed to fix it." Jake finally spoke up, his voice quiet. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know how to stop once I started." I turned to him, my anger spilling out. "And what exactly am I supposed to do, Jake? Bail you out so you can keep pretending everything's fine? Where was all this concern for the family when you were taking money that wasn't yours?" My dad stood up, his face red. That's enough, he said sharply. We're a family, Eric. Families stick together. We supported you when you needed it, and now it's your turn. It was like a switch flipped inside me. All those years of feeling like the forgotten child, the backup plan, came rushing to the surface. No, I said firmly. You didn't support me. You supported Jake. You made it clear over and over that he was the one who mattered, and now you want me to sacrifice everything for him. I won't do it. The room was dead silent as I grabbed my coat and walked out. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized that I'd finally hit my limit. For years, I'd let myself be the quiet, dependable one. But now, I wasn't going to carry the weight of their expectations anymore. Walking out of that meeting should have felt empowering, but it didn't, not right away. Instead, I spent the next few days replaying the confrontation over and over in my head, second-guessing myself. Was I being selfish? Was I wrong for refusing to help my family? The guilt was overwhelming, especially with the constant stream of messages from my parents. My mom sent long, emotional texts about how much Jake was suffering and how the family was falling apart. My dad, on the other hand, kept his messages short and cold. We thought you were better than this, one of them read. Even Jake reached out, sending me a half apology. I get why you're upset, but this isn't just about me, it's about all of us. Please reconsider. Every message felt like another weight pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was letting everyone down, even though I knew, deep down, that their demands were unfair. At the same time, a part of me felt vindicated. For years, I'd been pushed aside, ignored, and made to feel like my accomplishments didn't matter. Now, suddenly, I was the one they needed. It was hard not to see the irony in it all. I started talking to friends about what I was going through, something I'd rarely done before. Their support was a lifeline. They reminded me that I wasn't responsible for Jake's mistakes or my parents' unrealistic expectations. One of them even said, "Eric, you've spent your whole life trying to prove yourself to them. Maybe it's time to stop." That hit me hard. They were right. My entire life, I'd been chasing approval from people who only saw me as second best. Now, I had a chance to break free from that cycle, but it would mean making peace with the fact that my family might never see things the way I did. It wasn't an easy realization, but it was the first step towards something I hadn't felt in a long time, control over my own life. After weeks of guilt and second-guessing, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let my family's expectations define me anymore. It was time to stop living in Jake's shadow and focus on the life I had built for myself. The first step was cutting back on communication. I stopped replying to the endless stream of messages from my parents. It wasn't an easy decision, but every time I engaged, it just dragged me back into their web of guilt and manipulation. I needed space to think clearly and rebuild my sense of self-worth. Work became my refuge. My graphic design business was thriving, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel proud of what I'd accomplished. Without the constant comparisons to Jake, I started to see my achievements in a new light. I wasn't just doing fine, I was succeeding on my own terms. I also started reconnecting with friends I'd drifted away from. It was eye-opening to realize how much I'd isolated myself over the years, always feeling like I had something to prove. They reminded me that family doesn't have to mean the people you're born to, it can be the people who genuinely care about you and want the best for you. Over time, I began to feel lighter, freer. For so long, I defined myself as the other son, the one who was never good enough. Now, I was finally learning to see myself for who I really was, a capable, independent person who didn't need anyone's approval to succeed. Of course, the guilt didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, especially when I thought about my mom. But I reminded myself that taking care of myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of my own story. The calm didn't last long. After a few months of silence, my mom called out of the blue. Her voice was softer than usual, almost pleading, as she asked if we could meet for lunch. "No pressure," she said. "I just want to see you." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Part of me still held on to the hope that maybe things could change. We met at a quiet diner near my place. At first, the conversation felt normal. She asked about my work, my apartment, and even complimented me on how well I was doing. For a moment, I thought she might actually be proud of me. But then she brought up Jake. She started talking about how hard things had been for him, how he was struggling with the reality of his mistakes, and how much he needed support. "He's your brother, Eric," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "I know you've had your differences, but this is when family comes together." I felt my chest tighten. I'd known this was coming, but hearing it still hit me like a punch to the gut. "I've already told you where I stand," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "I'm not going to bail him out. He has to face the consequences of his actions." Her face fell, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not just about Jake. Your father and I are barely holding it together. The legal fees, the stress, it's too much. We just need a little help." There it was, the shift from emotional appeal to outright expectation. She wasn't just asking me to help Jake, she was asking me to fix everything. I took a deep breath and said, "Mom, I love you, but I can't do this. I've worked too hard to get where I am, and I'm not going to sacrifice that to clean up a mess I didn't make." She looked at me like I'd just shattered her world. "I never thought you could be so cold," she said quietly. I paid for lunch and left, my stomach in knots. After that lunch with my mom, I thought I'd made my position clear. But a few days later, my dad called. He didn't bother with small talk, he went straight to the point. "You need to step up, Eric," he said, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. "This family is falling apart, and you're sitting there doing nothing. Is that the kind of man you want to be?" I clenched my fist around the phone. "Dad, I've told you already, I'm not responsible for fixing this. Jake made his choices, and so did you. I'm not going to ruin my life because you refuse to hold him accountable." He scoffed. "You think you're better than us now? Just because you've got a decent job and live on your own? Don't forget where you came from, Eric. We're the reason you're here." That hit a nerve. I'd spent my entire life being overshadowed by Jake, and now my dad was trying to twist my success into something they could claim credit for. "No, Dad," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I'm here because I worked for it. Because I fought for everything I have while you were too busy putting Jake on a pedestal. You never supported me the way you supported him, so don't act like you're the reason I made it." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, he said, "Fine. If that's how you feel, then don't bother coming around anymore. You're clearly not part of this family." I hung up, my hands trembling. His words cut deep, but they also solidified something I'd been feeling for a long time. I couldn't keep trying to earn their approval. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying the conversation in my head. The sadness was there, but it wasn't crushing like it used to be. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. If they wanted to push me out of the family for refusing to sacrifice myself, so be it. After that call with my dad, I didn't hear from my family for weeks. At first, the silence was unbearable. I kept checking my phone, half expecting an apology or at least an acknowledgement of everything I'd said. But there was nothing, just a void where my family used to be. It hurt, but it was also strangely freeing. For the first time, I wasn't tied to their expectations or guilt trips. I could focus on my life without constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next demand would come. I threw myself into work and started taking on new projects that challenged me creatively. My career flourished in ways I hadn't expected. Without the emotional weight of my family dragging me down, I had more energy to dedicate to my passions. But the emotional toll was still there. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving came and went, and I spent it with friends who tried to make it special, but it wasn't the same. Christmas was even worse. I couldn't stop thinking about all the years I'd spent sitting around the tree with my family, even if those memories were tinged with the bitterness of favoritism. The loneliness made me question if I'd done the right thing. I'd always believed that family was supposed to be the one constant in your life, the people who stood by you no matter what. But my family had only stood by Jake, and when I refused to play along, they'd pushed me out. Despite everything, I knew I couldn't go back. I'd spent too many years being treated as second best, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice my peace or my future just to maintain a relationship that was built on unfair expectations. I told myself that if they ever truly wanted to reconnect, they'd have to meet me halfway. Until then, I was done chasing after their approval. With the silence from my family stretching into months, I started to focus more on myself. At first, it felt strange not having them as a looming presence in my life, but gradually, I started to enjoy the freedom. For the first time, I wasn't living under the weight of their judgments or expectations. I began investing in my friendships more intentionally. A close friend invited me to join a weekly trivia night at a local bar, and it quickly became the highlight of my week. I also picked up new hobbies, like hiking and photography, things I'd always wanted to try but never made time for because I was too busy navigating family drama. Work continued to thrive, too. I landed a major client that pushed my career to the next level, and I finally had enough saved to start thinking about buying my own place. Each milestone felt like a quiet victory, a reminder that I was capable of building something meaningful on my own. But even as I was moving forward, there were moments when the absence of my family hit hard. I'd see coworkers planning visits with their parents or hear friends complain about sibling drama, and it would sting in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't that I wanted to go back to the way things were, but I missed the idea of having a family who cared. Still, I reminded myself that stepping away wasn't just about protecting my boundaries, it was about reclaiming my self-worth. For so long, I'd defined myself as the other son, the one who could never measure up to Jake. Now, I was learning to see myself as more than that. I wasn't perfect, and I didn't have everything figured out, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly living for myself. The quiet didn't last forever. A little over a year after I cut ties, my mom reached out. Her message was tentative, almost like she was testing the waters. "Hi Eric. I know it's been a while, and I hope you're doing well. We miss you. Can we talk?" It caught me off guard. For so long, I'd been the one trying to bridge the gap, only to be met with indifference or manipulation. Now, they were coming to me. I hesitated for days before replying. I didn't want to ignore her, but I wasn't ready to dive back into the chaos either. Eventually, I sent a short response. "I'm doing well, thanks for asking. What did you want to talk about?" Her reply came quickly, and it didn't take long to see where it was heading. She mentioned how Jake was still struggling to get back on his feet, how the family had been through a tough time, and how much it would mean to her if I could come home for a visit. She kept the tone warm, but the subtext was clear, they needed something from me. A week later, my dad called. His approach was more direct. He brought up how well I was doing and how the family could use a little support while they got back on track. He framed it like a duty, like I owed it to them to step in now that Jake couldn't be the one to carry the weight. I felt the old frustration bubbling up, but I stayed calm. I told him I was glad they were reaching out, but I wasn't in a position to take on their problems. "I've worked hard to build a life for myself," I said, "and I'm not going to sacrifice that to fix something I didn't break." He didn't argue, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice. "I just thought you'd want to help your family," he said before hanging up. It was another reminder that, in their eyes, my worth was still tied to what I could do for them, not who I was. After those conversations with my parents, I knew it was time to take a firmer stand. For years, I danced around the truth, trying to protect their feelings while neglecting my own. But this time, I wasn't going to sugarcoat things. When my mom called again a few days later, I didn't dodge the hard topics. She started by asking if I'd thought about coming home for a visit, saying it would mean so much to everyone. Before she could veer into more requests, I interrupted. "Mom, I need to say something, and I need you to hear me out," I said. I told her how much it had hurt growing up in Jake's shadow, always feeling like my accomplishments didn't matter. I explained how I'd worked tirelessly to create a life for myself, only to have it overshadowed again by their constant focus on Jake. I'm not saying this to blame you, I continued. But you need to understand that the way you've treated me has consequences. I'm not going to keep putting myself in a position where I feel used or overlooked. If you and Dad want a real relationship with me, it has to be based on respect, not guilt or expectations. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. I didn't realize you felt that way, she said. I thought we were doing what was best for the family. Hearing that stirred up a lot of emotions, anger, sadness, even a little hope. But I didn't let myself get swept up in it. Actions would speak louder than words, and I wasn't ready to let them back in without proof that things would be different. When my dad called later that week, I gave him the same speech. He was less receptive, brushing off my concerns as dwelling on the past. But I stood firm, telling him that if they couldn't respect my boundaries, I wouldn't be part of their lives. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, I felt like I'd truly stood up for myself. After those tough conversations, my parents pulled back. There were no more calls asking for help, no guilt-laden messages about family unity. The silence felt strange at first, like a void where their demands used to be, but it also brought a sense of relief. For the first time, I truly let go of the idea that I needed their approval to feel whole. I stopped replaying old arguments in my head and let myself focus on the life I'd built. My work continued to thrive, and I took on a leadership role at my company. Outside of work, I poured energy into friendships and hobbies, creating a support system that felt more genuine than anything I'd ever experienced with my family. The distance gave me clarity. I realized that my parents' favoritism toward Jake wasn't about me being unworthy, it was about their own blind spots and inability to see value in anything that didn't fit their idea of success. That didn't make their behavior okay, but it helped me stop internalizing their neglect. I also came to terms with the fact that my relationship with them might never be what I wanted it to be. They had their version of family, and I had mine. And that was okay. Occasionally, I'd get updates about Jake through extended family or mutual friends. He was still struggling, bouncing between jobs and trying to rebuild his life. I didn't feel joy in his misfortune, but I didn't feel obligated to fix it either. For the first time, I could see his struggles as his own, separate from me. I wasn't bitter anymore. I wasn't carrying their baggage. I was free. Now that I've put real distance between myself and my family's dysfunction, I can finally say that I'm at peace. It wasn't an easy road, and there are still moments, holidays, birthdays, quiet nights, when I feel the ache of what could have been. But those moments don't define me anymore. I've built a life I'm proud of. My career is thriving, I have friendships that are deep and meaningful, and most importantly, I've learned how to value myself without needing someone else's validation. For so long, I thought I had to prove something to my parents, to show them I was just as worthy as Jake. But now, I see that their opinions don't define my worth. I do. My parents occasionally try to reconnect. My mom will send the occasional text or card, but it's always surface level, never addressing the deeper issues. I don't hold it against her, I've let go of the resentment, but I also don't chase after a relationship that doesn't feel genuine. As for Jake, I've heard he's still struggling, but we haven't spoken since the fallout. I don't hate him, but I also don't feel the need to mend things. I've let go of the idea that I have to save him or prove myself in comparison to him. His path is his own, just like mine is my own. Walking away from my family's expectations wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about choosing myself. And that choice has been the greatest gift I've ever given myself. At the end of the day, family isn't about perfection or obligation. It's about love, respect, and care, and sometimes, it's about stepping away when those things aren't there. I'll always wish things could have been different, but I'm proud of the life I've built, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'm free now. And that's enough.